Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the news that when you work out the practical impact of Trump's tariffs, they are hitting the UK harder than the EU. And this is being reported in a very Brexit supporting paper, the Daily Telegraph. So we've gone from the Trump tariffs apparently being a Brexit benefit to actually, no, now that we look at it, we're suffering way more than the EU. With Brexit wins like this, it's no wonder that Brexit supporters are the angriest people in the country. But first, for daily news and commentary, please hit the subscribe button to stay notified. So, what a turnaround. And for it to be reported in the Telegraph, the headline, Britain's tariff burden worse than the EU, which might sound odd. After all, you're thinking to yourself, well, hang on a minute. Trump has applied the same tariff rates to the UK and the EU. What's going on? On Liberation Day, Brexiteers were cock-a-hoop because he'd hit us with 10%, but the EU with 20%. I said at the time this was still not a Brexit benefit because leaving the EU had cost our economy way more than the difference between 10% and 20% US tariffs. But it became even more tragic for the Brexiteers, who were desperately clinging on to the first feeble Brexit benefit to come their way in years, like a Titanic survivor clutching onto the side of a lifeboat, only to discover that it's a particularly cunning shark. Because almost immediately, Trump cancelled the higher rate of Liberation Day tariffs, and it was all square between the EU and the UK. Only it's not. It's true that both have 10% baseline tariffs, both have 25% tariffs on steel, aluminium, cars and so on. But the real terms tariffs are based on, so how do these tariffs apply to the actual goods you export to the United States? The UK exports a lot of cars and machines, like a higher proportion of our total US exports compared to the EU. So when you work out the effective tariff rate on UK exports compared to EU exports, it works out that we're paying an overall net tariff rate of 12%, with the EU on 10%. In fact, the analysis actually showed that one of the hardest hit countries on the Liberation Day, Vietnam, is currently paying one of the lowest effective rates at 7%, thanks to all those Trump climb down exemptions. Speaking of which, I see he's started to climb down on his movie tariffs. Never mind that for now. So Trump has a massive beef with the likes of Vietnam for trade, but no specific criticisms of trade with the UK. That's why anyone that got hit with 10%, that was Trump basically saying, I ain't got an issue with you. The balance of trade is fine, but I'm going to hit you with 10% anyway because I want to raise the revenue. The only beef he actually has with us is we won't buy his hormone-fed beef or poisoned chicken. And yet Vietnam pays 7%, we pay 12% tariffs. I see his former VP, Mike Pence, has been criticising the fact that Trump's tariffs have, in reality, hit harder America's biggest allies and customers, and ironically not so much those that don't buy a lot of American stuff and for whom a lot of Americans would agree is a problem for their trade. So now we're in the situation where Brexiteers were cheering a month ago, albeit based on very dodgy analysis, and now are having to read in the most trusted pro-Brexit papers that the EU is better off than we are, even under Trump's tariffs. Incidentally, I'm just going to point out before I go on just how symptomatic this is of the Brexit way of thinking. So the Brexiteers were cheering, right? Now, what were they cheering? That Donald Trump had placed 10% tariffs on British exports to the United States. That's something that makes our business a struggle and means that British jobs will be lost, right? They were cheering that. Why were they cheering that? Because the EU got higher tariffs. And it's the idea, isn't it? These people, and this is the political reality of too many people these days, they will actually support someone who hurts them as long as they hurt someone else more. But anyway, I suspect Brexit supporters are eagerly awaiting the end of the 90-day pause period for Trump to raise the 20% tariffs back on the EU. But of course, this may not happen. Apart from the fact the pause was caused in the first place because the economic heat got a bit too much for Trump. Like he kept saying, oh, I'm just going to give them time to negotiate with me. It's like, well, why didn't you say that before you applied them? Why didn't you say, here are the tariffs I'm going to... He could have said that from the start, couldn't he? Here are the tariffs I'm going to apply in 90 days. Come and talk to me. No, he said, these are the tariffs that are going to apply. He waited right up until the day they were going to apply. Then said, oh, okay, 90-day pause. Why? Because the stock market melted. So, But the EU seem to have at least one cunning plan here, you see. In fact, there's a suggestion they may be able to kill two fascist birds with one stone. Hungary is, of course, Russia's advocate in the EU under Orban. Romania may be following before long. The EU have sometimes struggled to impose sanctions on Russia because of Hungary's opposition. But the EU Commission have announced a plan to essentially block all imports of Russian gas really quite quickly. Now, unlike an economic sanction which requires unanimous approval across the EU, the latest plan would only need majority support from the Council and Parliament, which should cock-block Orban. But it has another benefit too. See, the EU still needs gas, so if it stops importing gas from Russia, it has to get it from somewhere. If it doesn't buy it from Russia, it can buy more LNG from America. Now, I have seen some issues with that plan, by the way. It's not all clear sailing, but if it can be made to work, it could be a useful bargaining chip to use on Trump. We're willing to buy a lot more gas from you if you take your trade war elsewhere. Could be very appealing to Trump, who is already wary of some of the negative effects of his tariff policies and would love to sell a win. I mean, he could sell this as a big win, yeah? Cannot imagine he really wants to put them all back up to the original rates at the end of the 90 days. Imagine how crushing it will be for these Brexiteers. I mean, they spent years desperately searching around for Brexit benefits, which you could point at, tangible ones, not sovereignty. They finally think they found one, which was never a net benefit anyway, but you could see how they'd think it was. And it was snatched away from them by their great orange champion, the pro-Brexit president. And if come July, this dynamic remains and Trump's tariffs continue to hurt us more than the EU, all the Brexiteers will have done is draw attention to the fact that we should be back inside our continental market. Now, being clear, had we remained in the EU, it wouldn't have affected how much Trump's tariffs are hurting us. The difference is entirely down to the types of goods we mostly export to the US, which would not have changed by leaving the EU. However, because leaving the EU in the way we did cost us 4% of our GDP, we would be having way more trade inside the EU right now, even with Americans' tariffs. And what this issue with Trump's tariffs proves, beyond all doubt, is there is no way of compensating for lost EU trade, which nobody can deny, with America. Trump has made it clear that the tariffs are going to remain, even with a trade deal. He's not offering to get rid of the tariffs. That was the original plan from the Labour government. Do a deal, get rid of the tariffs. And he said, no, it's not up for discussion. Even if we eat their poison chicken. The tariffs, remember, for him are about tax raising and bringing production to America. It's not a tool to get trade deals. He only lets his supporters think that so they can think it's a cunning plan, art of the deal. But Trump wants the tariffs. He's said so for 40 years. When a very stubborn person says the same thing for 40 years, I'm not going to change their mind in a couple of days, particularly when that person is an old man surrounded by people telling him he's right about everything. And absolutely hilarious that the Telegraph are the ones explaining how much Trump, the pro-Brexit president, has damaged post-Brexit Britain. In fact, despite his stated affection for Britain and hatred of the EU, his tariffs have done more damage to British trade than EU trade. As they say, with friends like this, who needs enemies? But if you're thinking the Telegraph might be going soft on Brexit here, don't worry. They've got another editorial piece out attacking Labour for reversing Brexit. They complained about a minister saying how bad Brexit was for trade, even tried to attack Rachel Reeves for saying that our trade relationship with the EU was arguably more important than the US. The author of the piece suggested that Number 10 rebuked her for this. They didn't bother to quote the rebuke. Let me tell you what the rebuke was. So Downing Street were asked, oh, what's this about Reeves saying that the EU is more important than the US? To which they replied, she's just stating the obvious. Yeah, that's a stinging rebuke, that is. And of course, they're whining that the summit later this month is going to be used to reverse more Brexit. And the article makes out that this is all some sort of con, that Labour kept all of this very quiet, despite very loudly saying the EU would be their number one foreign policy priority. They said that before the election, and having very specific proposals for improved trade with the EU going back years, including on the alignment of standards. Also, I don't see the Telegraph arguing for an alternative. Here they are reporting on how much worse our trade with America is getting, when that was supposed to be the thing that justified the loss of trade with the EU. What's their idea now? The Democrats were not interested in a trade deal with us. Now the Republicans have decided that our trade should actually be worse with America. The dream's dead, guys. Doesn't matter who's in the White House, there is no path to a golden ticket for US trade. There never was, in all honesty. But even if we eat their poison chicken, which nobody wants to do, except Nigel Farage, Reform UK are actually the only party who wants to do that, even then it would not unlock a boost to exports needed to compensate for lost EU trade. Even the Brexiteers are having to face up to the damage Brexit has done. When will their followers take the hint and realise that a mistake rectified, whilst painful, is still better than a mistake doubled down on? But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe for further content. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can click the join button for memberships. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.